I guess I will pull it up on YouTube.
Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Rappin with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer, and look who we have here. We have Jake Adams from Reef Builders. Welcome, Jake, man.
What's up? Thanks for having me, Keith.
Yeah, really appreciate you taking the time out here, and you're live from the Reef Builders studio. So let me just do a little intro for you, Jake, here in terms of folks that might not know who Jake Adams is. Jake has been in the hobby since the mid-90s and has worked on the retail side of the marine aquarium trade for more than 10 years. He has a bachelor's degree in marine science and has been the managing editor of reefbuilders.com since 2008. Jake is interested and well immersed in every facet of the marine aquarium hobby, from the concept to the technology to rare fish and exotic corals. He has shared his knowledge and passion for the hobby by speaking at many reef club and marine aquarium events, and by writing articles for aquarium publications across the globe. His primary interest is in corals, which Jake pursues in the aquarium hobby, obviously with the studio, as well as diving the coral reefs of the world. So Jake, man, that's quite a background, and I've always been a big fan of yours, and you're a wealth of knowledge. So we really appreciate you being on the live stream. I see we have a lot of people that already tuned in, so welcome, folks, and feel free to ask away in terms of questions with Jake and I. And I have a whole bunch of questions myself, as per usual on this show, but we would love to take input from the viewers. So I will do my best to kind of keep track of the scrolling chat box on the screen here. But
sounds good.
Yeah. So Jake, man, you've been in the hobby since the mid-90s. How did it all start for you? What's the story?
Okay, well, Mom came home with a 30-gallon tank and 3 white veil tails and 3 black moors, and almost no information from the local fish store. And within 6 months, we had like 22 freshwater tanks throughout the house.
22?
And yeah, you know, just like this fish doesn't get along with that fish, so we need a different tank for that fish. And some of them were Rubbermaid containers. And I still remember my first saltwater tanks. I set up a 29 and a 30 next to each other at the same time with an under gravel filter. Everything was air driven. And I still remember my first piece of live rock. I pointed to the one that had the Aptasia on it because I wanted it. I wanted the thing.
It's got life.
But I think the first real reef tank we bought off the trader. So it was like a used tank, 75 gallon, had a Red Sea Berlin protein skimmer, Mag Drive 5, a couple Maxi jets. I don't remember what the lights started with, but it came with like VHO and ice cap ballast, and I had it back then. It was really complicated to set up. And I still remember just like I was always working on that tank to try to make things work better. You know, like for example, I had the mag drive as the return pump, and I thought it'd be super clever by pumping it directly to the hang-on back skimmer, not realizing that all the head pressure was just totally killing my air intake. And yeah, just I love the fish and corals I had in there. I always
Yeah, you got a little guess.
She knows somehow. She knows when like I'm on camera. I had a bubble coral. I had a saddleback clownfish. I had a purple tang. Way too much live rock. I would say that's the start.
So did you have any mentors back then? I mean, how did you kind of like know what you were doing, or did you just kind of like learn by doing? Did you kind of make some of those beginner mistakes and learn from those?
I mean, I guess the answer would be all of the above. I don't know. I didn't reference the books as much because, especially in the saltwater aquarium hobby, things change so fast that, and the moment you send a book to publication, like there's new tips and new tricks. So I read piles of magazines, just piles and piles, and just I don't know if I really learned anything from reading, but combination of what was said in the books, what was said in the magazines, and there was no forums at the time, and just actually working on my tanks. But I don't think I really learned anything because the information wasn't set in stone. Right. No one explained to you. It was really hard back then to explain what alkalinity was. It was. I think it was like 5 years before I realized, like, oh, the corals are made of calcium and carbonate, and alkalinity and buffering capacity and carbonate is all the same thing. And then you need a little dash of magnesium in there to glue it all together. So it's really doing, and there was just everything back then was new. Everything back then was discovery.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when I first got into the hobby 25 plus years ago, I picked up a few books. Julian and Dellenbach's book was one of the books I picked up. There was a couple of iconic books that I think are still great reads out there that are certainly worth anybody's while to take in. But it's a different world today, like you said. I mean, it's completely different. You've got forums. And you've got social media. There's a lot of information out there, and I guess that's the question: is for somebody coming into the hobby, how do you kind of sift through what's the good stuff in terms of the information, and maybe what's not so good?
I mean, it's funny because I make my living creating content online and writing articles and blog posts. The first thing I tell people when they want to set a saltwater tank up, I tell them not to read anything. Do not go online, because otherwise I'm going to spend 95% of my time explaining to you all these little things that you don't need to know. Everything you need to know about a saltwater tank, I can write down for you on an index card in like 5 minutes. Pretty much just the fundamentals.
Right.
So for a beginner, I mean, it's probably the easiest thing to do is, find a lead pony. Find a pony car and just follow through those footsteps. And, if you see the end result that looks good, stick with one person and kind of ape what they're doing. There's just almost no reason to read or learn until you have a base of experience, like just a small, let's say 3, 6, 12 months of experience. Everything you read is not going to make sense. You're not going to be able to sift through that information if you just dive into the deep end. And it's worse with online stuff, because someone might read about something on three or four different sources, and they got that self-confirmation bias. But those 3 or 4 people, they were referencing one person, and so misinformation spreads like wildfire. Useless techniques, for some reason, people just really, really go for them. I don't know why.
Yeah, you said something that was the exact same thing that Mike Paletta said on the show last week, and that is find a mentor. Find somebody to kind of hitch your wagon to, and that had has had success, and try to follow the that person's lead in terms of what they do in the hobby.
I would say that applies to 10 to 50-ish gallon tanks. Just a super basic saltwater aquarium with invertebrates, but once it gets a little bit larger and you have different mineral demands and you have higher concentration of corals, fish, and inverts, you want to have that base of experience. So you want to know which direction you're going to go. Am I going to go a calcium reactor? Am I going to go full Berlin style with no sand and a calc reactor? Or three or multi-part dosing, yada, yada. So
let's switch gears a little bit here, Jake. So these are certainly interesting times with COVID going on. How has COVID impacted what you have done? And then let's just kind of like talk about the industry in terms of what you see, how the industry has been impacted by COVID and potentially any lasting effects in the future.
Oh man, that is a thick slice of cheese to cut into. Dude, COVID has been such a double-edged sword for the general aquarium hobby, and probably even every home-based hobby, from brewing beer to houseplants to freshwater tanks to snakes. Anything that you can do and enjoy at home has benefited. Obviously, we're missing the conferences. We're missing the community. I find myself calling 2 or 3 people almost every day just so I can talk reef to somebody, and bitch about the coral prices. So every store that I know, every business that I know that I deal with, which is almost everybody's rocking, man. Right. Where a typical reef store, would have, let's just say, 75% of their value locked up in corals and frags and 25% fish. Now they're selling out of every fish almost weekly, and it's every store. On the one hand, it's really good, obviously for our general industry and for our local markets. But the only thing I don't like about it, because I'm a reef snob, is that every company is doing well. So you have, the people who aren't quarantining their fish, the people who are overpricing corals, and the companies who are selling products today that were released 8 years ago that don't represent I'm not even bleeding edge, but current edge. Those companies are thriving too, and so the only downside I see is some of the mean fish store owners are going to continue to do well for a few years. Some of the cheap Chinese products are going to. Everybody is just rocking, right? There is no natural selection happening in the market. So that's the good and the bad, and definitely the livestock prices are through the roof. If you look at the headlines, right? No one's going to read an article I write about, hey, check out this place. They have $10 corals, $10 coral classics. You can buy a whole tank full of corals for $200. No one's going to read that, right? They want to know that the price of yellow tanks has shot up to $500. Yeah. And so it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I saw pricing for yellow-eyed cold tangs now is around $400. I'm like, how did that happen? How did that happen? A yellow-eyed cold tang is now $400.
I have 22 yellow tangs. I have 8 Tomini tangs. I have 1 whitetail tang. I have tons of tangs. I love bristle tooth tangs. I absolutely do. but I've never, for some reason, I see a coal tank and I'm just like, nah. I don't know why.
That was a
I'm sure
that's a utility fish for me, you know, and it was not something that it's not a fish that I would invest that kind of money in for sure. I mean, there's other fish that I would absolutely rather spend that kind of money on, but it's kind of frightening in terms of what's going on with prices.
I'm not worried about it. You know, having, oh my God, I have my magazine over here. Actually, you know what? Let me grab
Yeah,
a
yeah,
magazine.
go
I
for
want
it.
to talk about something for a
Yeah,
second.
yeah. Hang in there, folks. Jake's grabbing a magazine. Somebody made a comment about your kick-ass music on your channel.
Oh, thank you very much. I would not make Reef Aquarium videos if I didn't have access to really good royalty-free music to use on the videos. But here's kind of, I think this is going to harken back to what's happening in the industry, right? So this is a freshwater and marine aquarium magazine from 1992.
I used to subscribe.
I went back and just bought a few issues that I knew had some good stuff in it. But first of all, it's 200 pages. I went to sleep one night, you know, went to bed thinking, oh, I'm just going to, you know, just mosey through this thing in 20, 30 minutes. It took me an hour, even looking at the ads. And there's so many things that are striking. But one of the biggest ones is the editorial is talking about aquarium bans from different places. Right when I got in the industry is right when Florida shut down the collection or the harvest of wild rock. So after that, you had to farm it yourself. And it's like 30 years later, the editorial is still talking about the exact same issues, the same issues. Yeah. And I'm not worried about it because the market really does have a way of sorting itself out. Like I said, the urgency of bans is something that I was born into in this industry. And I just, at the end of the day, there's always new corals, there's always new places that can open up. And we are fortunate enough now, maybe not so much on the fish side, because it's very hard to raise saltwater fish that isn't a clownfish or a dottyback. We're very fortunate that, like, you can find almost any coral right now, you know, that's culturable, right? You're not going to get frags of lobos or frags of scolemias or blastomusas unless it's Merletti. But the stuff that we all love and enjoy is still readily available.
So what do you see in terms of the manufacturing side? I mean, some of the manufacturing, you know, has been impacted because of, you know, supply chain issues. And well, you know, I think there's been in some of the products that I've you know, seen. There's been I guess delays in product launches because of supply chain issues, and stock has been kind of in and out for certain products. You haven't really seen that as a big impact because of COVID?
No, there is a black, and to me, there's absolutely like a black and white situation when it comes to aquarium manufacturers. You have real manufacturers, Kessel, AI, Ecotech Marine, who they might source some parts from China, but they might buy some of those parts like a year out, right? Like they if they're professional, they're really into manufacturing. And to do that, you have to have a very robust supply chain. Some of the, you know, the better companies in the reef aquarium hobby, they have one person who is their Tim Cook, right? Tim Cook at Apple used to be that supply chain manager. So the real manufacturers, they have a production machine that is, you know, it's got so much momentum. Like if everything shuts down, they're still pushing out product for a year. They might have constraints on certain components. Then on the flip side is what I'm seeing just so much, and I find rather gross, is the commoditization of aquarium goods. There's, you know, when I was looking at these magazines and getting the catalogs from That Fish Place and Debron Aquatics, I lusted over gear from Aquametic, just beautifully painted Giesman, Svilagoi, just stuff that, you know, somebody's hands had to make that stuff. And now if you look at companies like Aquametic in Germany, or TMC in England, or I don't want to name the American ones because they're closer to home. They're buying stuff from China, and they're not doing anything except slapping a sticker on it, man. It is actually, again, it's gross if you dig into some of this stuff. First of all, the Taiwanese made products, just by their sheer nature, are so much better. They have a very different engineering culture, manufacturing culture. And that being said, Shenzhen is nothing to scoff at. Like, there are people there that engineer really, really great stuff. And many of the great pumps in the aquarium hobby the motors are made over there, and then they're, kind of tweaked over here. So yeah, I just see way too much. Like, I've been going to the Interzoo for like 10 years. And, the first time I walked around from booth to booth to booth, and there's a French company, there's a Belgian company, there's an English company, and they all have the exact same protein skimmer with a different sticker on it. But you're seeing that to the nth degree now. You're seeing it way too much. I will call out TMC because they were selling these little LED pucks that I actually really loved, but they were labeling them at 78 watts when they only ran at 51 watts. That's not how that works. It's purely deceptive. And, this actually happened to me very recently with a major brand where I plugged in something that was supposed to be 500 watts and I was getting 300 watts. I'm like, I called up the rep and he just didn't seem surprised about that at all.
Oh, really?
So the commoditization means these companies don't really care that much about quality control or their products delivering what they say they will do. So you have certain companies that they're not making anything. They're speccing stuff. And those are the guys who have troubles getting shipments in because they're not making stuff in-house. And then you have real manufacturers who make original stuff. How long has the Ecotech Versa been out of stock for? They can't keep up.
Yeah, Reefkeeper made that comment. So what is going on, right, with the Versa pump in terms of not being able to find it? Been many, many months.
I don't want to speak on Ecotech Marine's behalf, but this is a result of everything, right? They have had so much demand for their lights. There's a lot more people who want sexy lights than want those, fancy pumps. And so they have to prioritize their manufacturing lines for one or the other. Do we make water pumps? Do we make flow pumps? Do we make lights? Do we make dosing pumps? So for them, it's a balancing act. Ecotech Marine, they've had ideas for all this stuff for 10 years.
Right.
I've known the boys for 15 years. We're all the same age. And we've talked about everything in the sun that you could possibly make, but it's, at the end of the day, it's what you put your resources into.
Yep. So you mentioned that you're kind of longing for the shows to start back up again. If you had to venture a guess, what would be your estimate in terms of when we're going to kind of see that happening again? Will it be something similar in terms of what's going on in the sporting world, where there'll be a limited number of people allowed into these trade shows, or do you think that I think that actually might be happening in certain trade shows, from what I understand? But
well, okay, it really depends. If we're talking about piddly little frag swap, like I went to one in July, there was 12 vendors and maybe 100 to 200 attendees in a giant room. All the booths were spread out 15 feet, and we can have those tomorrow. We had them last summer. That's no problem. But for the more professional shows like Reef Stock and Reef Palooza, we need a balanced diet of speakers, manufacturers, frag vendors, and then a healthy crowd to support all of that. So I don't see that till next year, bro.
Oh, really? Wow.
Dude, yeah. I mean, look at our rollout. Do you know anyone who has a vaccine?
I know some old folks, but yeah, I'm not expecting to get anytime soon myself. So yeah, I guess there was hope that maybe late fall or something like that we could potentially start seeing shows. But yeah, I would probably tend to agree with you. I think logistically it's going to be very challenging until 2022.
What kind of shows are we talking about? Are we talking about real hardcore bona fide reef shows that have everything you could possibly want and all your friends are there from all over the country, or something local that you drive to, pick up a couple frags and go home?
Right.
That's happening.
Right. So you've kind of adapted right now, right? I mean, you're doing these Reef Stock at home shows, which are online shows.
Mm-hmm.
how's that been going for you? Has it been a challenge to try to like pull those off? It's probably you got a lot of balls you're juggling up in the air with that sort of event online.
I kind of passed that buck.
Ah.
I told my partner and some of other associates, I'm like, I was involved with some of the early ones, but to be honest, like me personally, I love reef stock, but I've organized reef stock in 2 continents 15 times. I don't want to do it anymore. I want to come,
yeah.
I want to MC, I want to make sure everything's going good, but it's so much mental bandwidth, right? It is so much mental bandwidth. A year, 2 years in advance, you got to book the location. Year in advance, you got to book all the sponsors and vendors. 6 months in advance, you got to start putting a lot of pieces into place. 3 months in advance, you got to start, promotioneering, and then it's like every single day you got to. And it's really exhausting. I just want to play with my tanks, man. I just want to. I rinse my hands off probably like 10 to 50 times a day from getting in the tanks. There's not a day goes by I'm not moving a coral, gluing something down.
I'm with you. That's the fun part of this whole thing. Hey, Great Bearded Reef, thank you very much for that $5 donation. Really appreciate that. That is awesome. And I think we got one of your buddies in the house there, Jake, ACI Aquaculture.
What's up, Chris McAlee?
That might be Chris. And he told me, I was talking to Chris today, and he told me to ask you a question on the show tonight. So maybe I'll just blurt it out right now. He kind of, I know we had a conversation about the name game, and he said you had some pretty strong thoughts on the name game in terms of naming corals.
All right, you need to set a timer so I don't get lost in the rant. Give me 5 minutes. I'm not even kidding. I care more about the coral actually is. What is it actually, right? Because the reason I'm an asshole, and I'm sorry, but I am an asshole when people call them ACAN lords, because they have not been ACAN lords for like 6-7 years now. And the reason I'm really jerky about it, and I don't let it slide, I just call it a lord. You won't, is because if you put a lord next to an actual ACAN, you will end up with an ACAN, because it will eat that lord like that. You learn something by knowing the difference between a Cycloceras and a Fungia. They come from vastly different environments. They have different care requirements. They come in different colors. They reproduce differently. Like you are, when you were talking about how does someone get started, that's what I'm saying. Like, don't read anything, because there's all these names thrown about. Like people, the hobby overall has not even come to a collective understanding of how we name a freaking coral, right? And it's gotten so much worse because you have the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people have been in the industry, the hobby for 5 years, for 10 years. They think they've seen it all, and so like they'll go around and slapping names. Let me pull out 2 examples, really good examples. So the hobby in general, except in Europe, they actually call things what they are to the best of their ability. But in America, man, it's like Looney Tunes, Disneyland, all over the freaking place. And it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic. I've been to some of these, fancy coral vendors and places and had some beers with them. And dude, behind the scenes, they don't remember what name they threw on this or that coral. But on the flip side, it's also, the consumer is also to blame. Because when I worked at Unique Corals, we would put up maricultured colony of, let's say, just a small millie, like 3, 4, 5 branch slits, about this big. Put it up for $90. No name, no sale. You just come up with 2 stupid adjectives, and you make it a little bit smaller, and you can't keep them in stock.
Yeah.
People feel like they're buying into a club. But 2 examples of coral naming that has gotten out of control one is a weeping willow leather coral. I have seen the weeping willow is my coral. That is mine. Don't take that away from me, man. That was my coral for 15 years before I told anybody about it. The only person who has any is Sanjay. Maybe I shouldn't say that, because otherwise they're
gonna be hitting him up for that. Well,
he's not a coral vendor
no.
for me. And I did give Remy from Bahama Llama. I gave him my blessing to call his weeping willow. I mean, to be honest, it should be weeping willow style. But I've seen that name just like overnight. You know, I said only my friends knew about the weeping willow leather coral. Weeping willow was a name you first applied to thin branching Sinularia soft corals because their branches would droop over in slow flow and like literally look like a weeping willow. And that's why the weeping willow sarcophyton got its name, because when you turn down the flow, the polyps, not the branches, they fall over the crown. The Coral Nursery in Kentucky just took the name. I don't even know if they know what the descriptor came from. Aqua SD had their name, had the weeping willow on something. Some random coral vendor in New York just threw it around. And this was the worst one. Sorry, Stephen, but Top Shelf Aquatics has an ORA weeping willow, which is the same large polyped Micronesian sarcophyton that has nothing to do with the weeping willow. I have another long polyp leather coral, extremely long polyps. It is not a weeping willow. You turn the flow off, the polyps stay like this far up. They're just as long as a weeping willow, but they don't fall over. So that's one where I'm just like, either we agree that we are going to stick with the Latin names to the best of our ability, or we agree to concur on some of these trade names for corals that are special and deserve it. But no one's doing that. If you know what, every time I come up with a coral name, dude, I just do a little quick Google search, coral, and there'll be 3 different corals with that name on it: Hellraiser, Hellfire, Firestorm, Firestarter. It's just like, there's not even any creativity to it.
No, I mean, I remember, you know, in terms of like some of the old school corals that, you know, first came out that had the names like the Tyree Purple Monster and the...
I rebuke you.
Oh, it's not Tyree. Okay, right. That was...
I get what you're saying, Ray, but Tyree had so little to do. I mean, Tyree had... If it wasn't him, it would have been someone else. And so he was very influential in starting that trend. I mean, I remember reloading Reef Farmers. Actually, I remember dynamicecomorphology.com before it turned into Reef Farmers in like late 90s. And, you know, it was cool. It was fun. It was clubby. But when it was small and everybody could kind of keep track of what was what. But the Purple Monster, you know, someone in the Solomon Islands went out to the reef, collected it, shipped it, brought it in. They did the work, right?
Yeah.
Definitely take umbrage to people just throwing their name on a coral they discovered. You don't discover corals in Los Angeles. You don't discover them in Detroit. You don't discover them in New York. You discover them on the reef. So as far as I'm concerned, the only people who can really put a name to a coral is Vincent Chalias, who's actually farming this stuff.
Right, the people that are picking them out of the ocean.
Yeah, and some of those classics straying, you know, the Langside cap. It didn't even need a name. It's the cap, the purple rim cap that came from Langside. Very descriptive. Purple Monster, still, like, to me, one of the coolest, neatest corals of all time. Or the green branching cap. It didn't have a silly name. It was a descriptive name. I feel that way about Euphyllias today, where you cannot even keep... Dude, there's 5,000 new names for different slight strains of torch corals right now. And they're throwing the names on freshly imported corals that has no bearing on the strain. Great example. I bought my Dragon Soul as a Holy Grail. And then 2 years later, there's a Holier Grail, but instead of calling it the Holier Grail, which would have been funny, you know, Worldwide Corals influence basically kind of eclipsed what other people were calling the Holy Grail, and they were calling that the Dragon Soul. But now I've refused to play that game. It's an orange torch coral with green tips.
Yeah, what's up with anemones too? I mean, like a Colorado sunburst anemone. What's I mean, that is a pricey anemone.
What's funny is, like, I've been growing the Colorado sunburst for about 15 years, and I still remember a buddy of mine. Like, I know the whole story, like top to bottom, who discovered it, the first guy who grew it. I saw the first grow out tank of it. Dude would not let me take a picture because he didn't want to know how many he had. It was only like 40 and 180, and he had 2 or 3 rose bubbles in there, and the rose bubbles looked dull. It was crazy. But I remember the first guy who told me about it locally. he said, "Oh yeah, we've got this really cool orange sunburst, or no, sorry, orange bubble tip, because it wasn't a sunburst. We're calling it the sunburst, and we're getting $300 each." And I was like, "You are crazy! No one would ever pay $300 for a sunburst." So locally, they were about 300 locally for like 10 freaking years. And, you know, so for certain strains that have a proven track record of being cultured in the aquarium hobby, they do deserve a name, you know? And it was at a reef stock that one year, just, you know, things were just a little bit higher demand. And it went to 600. And then the next year at reef stock, it was Reef Koi, who's been around the hobby for a long time locally. Somebody else had just thrown a sticker out there for $1,800 and sold it like that. And it's really frustrating that a lot of the value of the corals is from speculation, you know, like the rainbow tenuous that are happening right now. I don't want to get into that, but let's wrap up the coral naming with one coral. There is no such thing as a purple stylophora, which isn't the Milka stylo. The Milka stylo, for those of you that don't know, haven't been to Europe, Milka is a popular brand of chocolate, and it comes in a lavendery purple wrapper. You know, so it means something. Milka stylo. That coral was grown out all throughout Europe for like 15 years before Ore got a piece legally. You know, just they did a small shipment or something, I don't remember, and then it got distributed into the reef aquarium hobby. And if you go out and look for purple stylos, you will find as many names as there are coral vendors. I've seen people put Sanjay's name on it. And first, that coral is so special. And if you don't know the real name of it, you don't know the entire history of it. That is the only stony coral in the aquarium hobby that is from the Red frickin' Sea.
Oh, really?
Think of all the corals we have. 90% of them are from the Coral Triangle. Let's just call it Coral Triangle. And then more recently is Australia. And then a very small amount from Central Pacific. That is the only stony coral of its kind from the entire Indian Ocean. Like, we get some from the west coast of Australia, which is technically Indian Ocean, but to me that's still like Australian. But yeah, that coral's been in captivity for 35 freaking years. You will never see a wild purple stylophora that was collected in the Red Sea, or maybe right outside of it, by Jean Joubert. You know the Joubert Platinum system?
Yeah, yep.
He collected that in the late 80s. I specifically, and that was grown out at the Musée Océanographique de Monaco, the Monaco Aquarium, basically. It was grown in this Joubert, the first Joubert Platinum tanks, like 10 years before it got spread out to anybody else. So if you don't know the name of the coral, then you don't know this super rich history that's associated with the purple stylophora. Everybody just takes it for granted that it's a thing. I remember seeing it in France, because I've been to Europe many times. I remember seeing it over there and getting parts of that story before we even had any varieties of stylophora. So when it comes to the name game, like, I mean, people need to put their foot down. They need to figure out what we're going to do for naming. Okay.
I totally agree with you. I think it's gotten completely out of hand. I think the prices are insane. I think there's some corals out there. There's a couple that I've seen that could be worthy of the hype and the name. I guess there's some the rainbow splice coral out there is a pretty badass aquapore coral, and
no, it is a pretty badass looking photo of a coral. Have you seen one?
Not in person.
Have you seen one this big? Have you seen one this big? Is it all pink? Is it all green? Is it crazy swirly like you think it will be?
I don't know.
You haven't seen that coral.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So when it comes to grafted corals, I wouldn't say terrible experience because they grow and they're fine, but one color takes over the rest. Like for some of you that keep maybe like some houseplants, very similar thing as the variegations, and you have one of two things happen over a long period of time. Either the variegation takes over and the leaves become all white, therefore the plant cannot photosynthesize and it dies, or the variegation gets outgrown by faster parts of the plant. So you have to maintain a balance of green versus white leaves, or half green and half white leaves. So if you want a high maintenance coral that you're always going to be fragging, that's great. But you and me, man, we're a little bit old timers. I like a colony from across the room. Same thing with every single one of these rainbow tenuis. I collected rainbow tenuis. They are the least impressive corals from 2 feet away.
I am in the same I'm the same ballpark. I mean, I love brightly colored corals that you can see at a distance. So I love pink bird nests. I love
pink bird's nests.
I love purple, pink stylophoras. I love the green the Green Valley Slimer. I do like the Oregon. I think I pronounced that right. I always pronounce Oregon wrong, and I get a lot of crap for it. But the Oregon blue tort is probably my favorite coral, and it is a named coral, but I think it's just...
That one deserves it. Yeah. There's never been another coral imported to the aquarium hobby that has lasted the test of time like the Oregon tort. We know where it came from. Obviously, it didn't come from Oregon reefs, right? It's just one of the first places it was discovered. When you see an Oregon tort as a frag, as a colony, it always looks the same.
But to me,
I got it all over the studio.
But to me, a reef tank, the way I treat a reef tank in terms of an SPS dominant reef tank, it's kind of like a canvas, and I like to paint, and I just think about in terms of the the different colors in that tank and what it's going to look like from across the room or from a few feet away. And
a virtual high five.
There you go.
I would like to commend you. I actually referenced you without saying your name in one of my last videos about aquascaping, because I have the scolemia tank, which is just a flat wall of rock, but I'm not aquascaping with the rock. I'm aquascaping with the corals. And so when I saw your tank, which had, I don't know, what'd you put in there, like 80 pounds?
It's 100 pounds at a 225-gallon tank.
Yeah, that's what you should be doing.
Right.
And it's really frustrating and somewhat infuriating to get judged by hyper newbie reefers who've only seen totally packed coral tanks give you criticism on your aquascape, because that's all they've seen is the bling-in tanks of Instagram. I saw your tank, bro, and I was like, that's a kindred spirit. That guy is exactly on the right track. So I want to say right now, for anybody who's setting up a tank in the size range of about 100 to 300 gallons, you want to do well, definitely follow Keith's journey, Jake. Because from what I can tell, you're definitely making some good decision making.
Well, listen, you and I have been in the hobby for a long, long time, and I've learned a lot over the years, and I've made a lot of mistakes. I mean, at the beginning, I used to create brick walls with rock in my reef tanks. I used to do the old,
guilty.
Yeah, I used to do the old 2 pounds per gallon type of thing, and that was kind of like the thing to do, because that was the biological filtration that you have for the tank, and you didn't have dry rock back then, and that's the way you started a reef tank, a lot of rock. But
well, so I think one of the things that the hobby is very slowly refining is all the advice that came from the local fish stores. I worked at local fish stores. I said, so many inches of fish per gallon, so many pounds of rock per gallon, so many pounds of sand per gallon, so many cleanup crews per gallon. And you need to do this, to do this, to do this, to do this. And eventually you're going to have some, of course, you want to feed a ton of frozen food, and then you're going to have phosphates. And then you're going to come to me with some algae issues. I'm going to sell you more cleanup crew, and we're going to get you set up with the media reactor. And then I'm going to sell you GFO, or back then would have been PhosGuard, once a month. And it was just like, I don't think it was intentional, and I don't think it was conniving, but most of all the things we think we know about the saltwater aquarium hobby in particular was dictated by what the fish stores told us. And it wasn't wrong per se, but it wasn't the easiest way to do things, and it wasn't the most effective way to do things.
Right. So we've got some chat going on here. I'm trying to keep track of it. I see Greg Carroll is still waiting on Keith to ask him about rock or sand. I think we're talking about sand or bare bottom. You keep bare bottom tanks, right? For the most part.
In my mind, there is zero reason to have sand. other than the aesthetics. But the drawbacks are countless, just on and on and on and on. You know, how many times are you supposed to answer to somebody, oh, I tried to up the flow, but it blew my sand around? Like, how many times do I want to have that conversation and try to explain to somebody, like, flow is more important than your sand? You know, people talk about surface area. Have you ever walked up to a tank and said, oh, man, this tank has a lot of surface area? Or it looks like you feed this tank a lot of phytoplankton. Like, I don't value anything that you can't see the results of. Ick in a tank. It is really, I'm going to change my superlatives. It is really hard for a fish to die from ick in a tank without sand. If there's nowhere for the ick spores to go, you don't need a UV sterilizer. It'll just get filtered out or skimmed out, or it just won't survive. But if you have sand in a tank and you have ick, good luck with that. Nutrient uptake. You know, people talk about, oh, it's my denitrification. And I used to be on that train too, man. I used to be on that train too. But now I don't have sand, so it never, you know, the nutrients never build up. And when the HANA, the new nitrate checkers came out, my 600-gallon system that probably has 500 corals and, I don't know, 50, 60 fish, the nitrates were 0.00. No sand. You know, and so it's like everything you think sand is doing for you, it isn't.
Yeah, I have always kept sand in my reef tanks, but I've had ugly sand beds. And, you know, I like wrasses. I like to keep leopard wrasses, and I know there's wrasses you could have in a bare bottom tank. But I've always kept sand in my tanks just because I thought it was part of the aesthetic look of a good-looking reef tank. But, you know, my new Peninsula tank is bare bottom, and that's a first for me. And
you are gonna love it so much. There are so many issues that you think are gonna arise from your experience that won't. It won't happen.
Yeah, and you know, the big reason is because it's going to be an SPS dominant tank. You know, the tank is about 3.5 months old. I still don't have any corals in there, but that's gonna change pretty soon. So, you know, we talked about this before the show. I want to have all of my recirculating pumps at the end of the tank. I don't want to have anything on any of the viewing panels. Now, you've done some videos on ways to hide recirculating pumps in a reef tank, but a Peninsula tank, it's a challenge, right? I mean, if
no, because your Peninsula, you have an external overflow box,
right?
Yeah, so you see them a little bit more. So both of my Peninsulas have an internal overflow box, and so it just kind of hides, like,
they're tucked in.
You know, if this is, yeah, they're just kind of tucked in, and I just kind of always forget that they're there.
But yeah, so I mean, that was the reason why I went with the bare bottom in that tank, was because it's a Peninsula tank, and I'm cranking a lot of flow at that one of the tank, and there's just, I think, no way to be able to keep sand on the bottom of that that tank. So
I'm definitely a contrarian, right? I'm not a wrasse man, but wrasses are stupid. They don't know if they're hiding underneath the rock or in the sand, unless, okay, there are specialist sand diving wrasses. I would never keep a razor wrasse without sand. Like, they swim in the sand. You know, jawfish, absolutely freaking, like, they need to build a little burrow. You know, but other than that, man, I got leopard wrasses for years. I got Namsies for years. No sand. They go hide under something. They don't know.
Oh, really? So you're keeping them without sand?
I don't have any sand anywhere.
Wow.
I actually, that's not true. I have mangroves in Refugite from Two Little Fishies, and I put heavy river stones, a thick layer on top of that, specifically so the leopard wrasse wouldn't be able to get in there and stir stuff up. They'll find something. They'll just go hide under something. That being said, I'm not a hardcore wrasse man, but I have plenty of wrasses over the years. And if we're being real, it's really only the leopard wrasses that maybe need it, and pencil wrasses. But nobody keeps pencil wrasses for a long period of time. So, all right, if you feel bad about it, don't fill your tank with sand. Do what the experts do. Put a little tray in there.
I'm gonna make a quote from the movie Boogie Nights. You were what you dig, and I think with a reef tank, you keep the fish that you dig. in the reef tank, and that's the beauty of the hobby.
Yeah. I think it's important for us veterans to be flexible to new trends and to new ways of doing things. You know, I don't even remember how exactly I felt when the frags started getting smaller. You know, this used to be a frag, like a chunk, and then they got smaller and smaller and smaller.
Now you got quarter-inch frags.
I thought it was, you know, really bad back in the day, but now you can find Sunset Monty in every corner of the country. You know, Rainbow Monty, you can't give it away. Like some of these strains that used to be $100 per square millimeter, now you can't give them away.
I've got so much Sunset Monty in my frag tank, and so much Mystics. I mean, you're right.
Oh,
you can't get rid of it.
Mystic Sunset's a fun one because me and a buddy of mine, we use it as glue. We literally like, do we want those rocks together? Okay, let's glue some Mystic Sunset, let it grow on there, and then we'll kill it.
Superman Monty, awesome. So Paula Pal is, and this is a question I had for you too, Jake. Let's talk about live rock versus dry rock. What are your thoughts in terms of what's going on with the dry rock scene, and then the negative space aquascapes and all that fun stuff? What are your thoughts on dry rock? I mean,
I'm gonna lean in for this one. I'm gonna say something really philosophical, and I want everyone to hear me clearly. On a long enough timeline, everything becomes a pest. I could tell you what the reef tank of the future looks like. It has nothing in it besides the coral and bacteria. I promise you, this is the direction we're going, right? People set up these, test tube display tanks at the events in a few hours, and then it's fine. Everything is freaking fine. You know, I set up tanks like that too. But on a long enough timeline, everything becomes a pest. You know what my pest is? Sponges and coralline algae. Coralline algae grows out of control. It competes with the corals for minerals and nutrients. At night, it represents a huge amount of biomass that puts CO2 into the system. It's so everything becomes a pest. Yellow polyps, sympodium. I have to harvest. This is my fault. This is a fault of my environment. My water has 2 ppm silicate. Does not matter. It does not matter for corals. But I grow sponges like, I hate them. I hate them so much, man. I have to harvest sponges all over the place. Little ball sponges, little encrusting sponges. So on a long timeline, if you let your reef tank go, you would have one coral. This is how the reef works. This is how ecological succession is supposed to transpire. So with that in mind, do you want to roll the dice and introduce 50 to 100 different things that you don't know what they are? Give me 1 second. I need to plug in, use a bathroom. So give me a few minutes, talk to people in chat, and I'll pick back up.
All right. Well, folks, Jake is going to take a couple of minute hiatus, and it's interesting because in terms of the live rock versus the dry rock discussion, I've always been, and I've talked about this before in my live stream. I've always started tanks with live rock versus dry rock, and I had a bad experience. I know Greg Carroll is watching, and we've talked about this before in terms of dry rock, but it's I think it's something that in terms of what we have available today, most people are going to be starting their tanks with dry rock, and it makes total sense. I just I do think it does take a little longer to have the tank mature and be ready for corals versus live rock, but that is just my opinion. I know when I had Mike Paulette on last week, he was a big advocate of going the live rock route because of all the sponges and the biodiversity on the live rock. So I guess it's a personal preference, but with my new 225 gallon tank, starting with live rock, it's been, knock on wood, kind of smooth sailing right now. It's interesting, but I hear you folks out there that start tanks with dry rock. It's really it's the main option these days. So it's just looking at some of the chat folks here. ReefBum, Brock B. What would be your one coral if you were going to grow out a single coral species tank? Jake.
Yes.
All right, we got a question from Brock B. I guess it's a.
Before that, I want to finish up my point.
Yeah.
On a long enough timeline, everything becomes a pest. Absolutely, dry rock is the only way to go, because we spend, I mean, think about it, how much of our mental bandwidth is devoted to coral? When it comes to a reef tank, it's like 98% of our time is thought about this coral versus that coral and what the coral needs. The fish are easy, as long as you get past the disease and quarantine procedures, and you don't really think about the fish except interactions with the coral. No one is, unless you really want that reef ecology, and you like all the little critters, and you like all the little bugs. You know, nobody's starting a thread about some weird copepod they found in their tank. There's no designer amphipods for sale anywhere, right? So yeah, on a long enough timeline, it won't be just dry rock. I think it's going to be artificial decorations, because I rail against porosity. Right? Porosity is just a place for more biomass to build up, more nutrients and detritus and stuff to get locked in, and that stuff is not doing anything for you. So yeah, on a long enough timeline, not only are we just, the idea of using wild rock or, you know, cured, you know, any kind of that rock, that's going to be for people who want the reef ecology. But for the general 99.9% of us who just really care about the corals, in the future, corals are all going to be tissue cultured, and there will be nothing in your aquarium that you didn't add specifically.
So while you were away, I was kind of recapping my experience with dry rock versus live rock, and I've always started my tanks with live rock. The one time I did try dry rock, it was pretty much a disaster for me a few years ago, and I just I had.
Did you have sand? Did you have sand in the tank?
I did. I did have sand in the tank, but yeah, you know, it was not a pretty scene. So I broke the tank down, and I was in Florida for vacation, and I found some Haitian live rock, which was 4 years ago. I don't think you could find Haitian live rock anymore.
It was always kind of gray market to begin with.
Oh, you really? Okay. So I was able to snag some of that and put it in my 187-gallon tank. But so I've had great experience with live rock. I've had shitty experience with dry rock. I know Mike Pleta was on last week, and he had kind of a similar experience with dry rock in his 90-gallon tank. The rock that I started the new Peninsula tank is live rock, and it had great biodiversity on it. And I agree in terms of the pests that you get with the live rock. You're rolling the dice. You really are. I mean, when I put that live rock in a high specific gravity solution to flush out, you know, some of the bad critters, I got a manna shrimp, I got a whole ton of pistol shrimp, I got some suspect looking crabs. You know, I got a lot of stuff out of that live rock. But you know, it has been smooth sailing. Maybe it's because I've got bare bottom tank. I don't know. But I hear you in terms of what you're saying with dry rock versus live rock, and just you don't really have that many options, I guess, these days anyway with live rock.
I don't even think of it in terms of that, man. I think of plastic step stools and cinder blocks and river rock, just anything that just doesn't look goofy, you know. But in my mind, I want it as non-porous as possible, as inert as possible. So I will use anything. I think concrete is probably the future. But yeah, I think definitely down the road, if you want fewer issues, like I don't know what issues people could have with dry rock, right? Some dry rock is actually old live rock that came from somebody's tank or harvested from the ocean, and it would never cured. It could be full because of the porosity. There's so much funk growing inside. I will always take the cleanest, driest, least porous stuff possible.
What are your feelings on the NSA, the negative space aquascapes? Do you think it is worth the time to craft something like that? I mean, my point is that I don't think...
Is that what they're calling it?
Yeah.
I spend no time on forums. You know, my aquascaping style actually is referenced from freshwater plants. Like I've had so many freshwater plant tanks, and you know, I would never designate something as a negative space aquascape. Like you want open space, for water flow, for the ecological reasons, and then for the aesthetic reasons, like, if everything, if it's just a field of corals and it's like all kind of the same, your eye needs a path. It needs a path to get drawn in here, to get drawn in over there, and so, yeah, I don't know. That being said, I think it's important for us, more experience, not because we have more experience, but because we've experienced more, to not get set in our ways, to not say, this is how you do it. This is how things are supposed to be. This community, this global community, is informed by the participation of more and more and more people and more ideas, for better or for worse, when it comes to absolutely atrocious, useless coral names to interesting techniques and different ways of doing things.
Yeah, I think if you stick to the to the basic principles of reef keeping and abide by that also with aquascaping, and by that I mean what we talked about. I think less is more. You want to have the open space. You want to be able to have circulation. If you have an SPS dominant tank to help. You want to also anticipate a couple years down the road when that tank matures and the corals actually grow out, right?
Wait, anticipate what?
Yeah.
Plan ahead? Americans? That's not what we do.
Yeah, right?
Look at the vaccine rollout.
Oh, well, let's not get into that discussion. So I think you gotta. It's definitely evolved in terms of what's become more popular, and I dig the bonsai aquascapes, and I dig some of this NSA stuff. But I also think that maybe people are spending a little bit too much time on that stuff, because eventually the corals will grow in and cover that aquascape.
You and I have seen more than enough freshly aquascaped reef tanks packed with corals, and you're like, no, that doesn't work. That's going to work for like 2 months. Like, back to what I was saying, on a long enough timeline, everything becomes a pest. You leave the reef tank alone, all the stuff alone, you end up with one coral. That's just how that goes.
So Jake,
like you've seen these old tanks that people are tearing down online in your local groups or on forums, and there will be like 50% of the coral mass is going to be cold coral or leather coral or candy coral or scroll or echinopora. Like, you've already seen this in action when you see people tear down tanks and they have bushels of 4 types of corals.
All right, man. So we're an hour into the stream, and I got like a ton more questions to ask you here, but I don't.
No one can out talk reef me. You want to do this? Let's go.
Are we talking? We talking a marathon here, Jake?
As long as the watchers are there.
A Rappin With ReefBum marathon. All right. Let's talk about the studio. How did that come about? What was the idea behind the studio?
So from the beginnings of working, when I joined Reef Builders and then became a partner, I always had a bunch of tanks at home, where things were kind of shoehorned to do this or to do that. And, back then I had roommates and then girlfriends, and it's not great to, clean out filter socks or protein skimmers in the kitchen because you don't have a dedicated sink. And, Reef Builders has grown a lot over time, and I always wanted a dedicated workspace that could maximize everything I want to do. Water changes, boom. It's like the infrastructure is here. I can put a coral in a bandsaw and clean up in like 5 minutes. So I always had this idea, but I also knew it would be about timing, as far as like me being ready to handle it, and Reef Builders being able to absorb some of those costs, so we could really put the effort into creating original content that isn't informed by the headlines of Facebook or online forums. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Like, I'd ever want to be responding to what's going on out there. Like, I have enough. I could spend a month literally just talking about pH. I know that you don't think so, but I really could. Every day have a different article about pH, the war on pH, having too many fish, having deep sand bed, having a huge biomass, increasing evaporation so you can dose more kalkwasser. Just bring in fresh air from outside. It just goes on and on and on and on. And so the studio was just really built out of that.
So what have you learned, with the studio in terms of what was the in terms of the vision? Did you fulfill the vision, or is it still evolving?
The vision was to have all the corals I ever wanted and never be limited in what I could have. Because at my previous residences, I had maybe like a couple, 3 reef tanks and then a few fish tanks. And here it's just like, you can hand me any coral and I have a spot for it.
Yeah.
I can do everything. But I just wanted it to be clear. I didn't set up the studio so I can create content. I create content so I can have the studio and have all the tanks I ever wanted, test all the gear. I love testing good gear. There's so much junk. And so I got a 2-foot tank, a 3-foot tank, a 4-foot tank, a 3-foot cube, 2 peninsula tanks. I got a fish tank. I've got some flat tanks. And so any coral you throw at me, any piece of equipment you throw at me, I can use it. I can test it, And I didn't, previously, I had normal reef tanks. And so anytime somebody sent me a new light or new pump or this or that, like, it was very disturbing to the balance of the aquarium to change what I was doing. And so this way, there's a couple tanks that are always earmarked for, okay, this tank needs a new pump, this tank needs a new light, or I want to try out this light versus that light. So nowadays, unless it's for public aquariums, you can throw anything my way and I can put it in the, the queue for thorough review. You see so many reviews where people don't even fire up the skimmer. They just have it in their lap and they're just like, this is a great skimmer. Oh, it's really sturdy. Look at that ARID.
It's an unboxing.
Just like, put it in the tank and run it for a while. Like, every piece of equipment almost works great on day one. But one of the things that people don't understand is you absolutely get what you pay for. I'm calling out GBAL and every relabeled GBAL product, Aquamatic, you're on notice. The pumps lose magnetism over time, and you will never know that. They won't break. They still work, right? But if you get a new GBAL and one that's been running for a year, exact same model. I mean, you could get them from the same batch, run one for a year, put them next to each other, and the flow coming from the brand new pump, because the magnetism hasn't been used up, is like 2 to 3 times as much as the other one.
Yeah. All right. I got a question from chat based on a comment you just made earlier about pH, and then I want to get into some of the product stuff with you, Jake. So we got a question from Brock B in terms of the pH. What are your thoughts on the ideal pH, and what do you run your tanks at? What's your target pH levels?
I would preface that by saying I am not super worried about the pH swing. I don't think that matters at all. If you're ranging from 8.2 to 8.4 or 8.0 to 8.2, don't worry about the swing. It doesn't happen in the ocean, but over 25 years, no one has had a baller reef tank because their pH was within 0.01 for the whole year. So that's the first thing. Like, don't worry about the swing. Just bring the entire swing up.
Right.
And then the other thing that people don't understand is, like, if you have your lights on for 8 hours, that means you have them off for 14 hours. Is that math right?
16.
16. Yeah, that was my first one. So if you have a short photo period and what I'm starting to describe as a non-photo period, you have a longer period of time for the pH to build up.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So when you're starting out a new tank, you definitely want to have that shorter period to just keep all those algae back and let your corals really settle into the system. But for me, ideal pH is probably 8.2 to 8.4.
Yeah, I agree.
And
yeah.
The thing is, I am at high elevation in a very dry climate, so I can evaporate all the water I want. I can dose all the kalkwasser I want. And this does not reflect the experience of most sea level reefers or people who live in a humid environment. They're not, it's just not going to happen for them. So they need to figure out some other stuff. But 8.0 to 8.2, I think is fine. I mean, it's totally fine. You'll grow fine. But kind of bringing it full circle to some of the things we said earlier on with Chris Meckley. Like I talk to him once or twice a week because we get to take these ideas, pH has always kind of been a side parameter for most folks, just something they sort of think about. But I did a video almost 2 years ago now about like, hey, yo, you need to jack up your pH. But then I kind of like walked away from it. And then Chris picked it up and he started really experimenting with stuff. And then Brightwell came out with a product called Boost pH. And so that collaboration where the idea goes around and around and around with a few people, we're really comparing notes. That's what I miss the most about the Reef conferences. So 8.2 to 8.4, I think is going to be really hard for most people to achieve, unless they just take unnecessary or just really extravagant means to prevent that.
And are you mostly running a calcium reactor, or are you doing any 2-part dosing, or is it pretty much calcium reactor is what you're using at the studio?
I don't even all right, so like for example, my 6-foot water box, every time I'm looking over, I'm literally looking at the tank I'm talking about. I'm like, well, that tank right there. All right, for example, my 6-foot water box, like it'd be kind of silly to set it up with a calcium reactor that will satisfy the needs of that tank when it's fully grown of SPS. And so I will probably start out every tank on 2-part, but as soon as the corals reach a critical mass or it's a certain volume, it just makes so much more sense to use a calcium reactor.
Right. Yeah. I'm dosing 2-part in my 187-gallon tank, and I'm dosing 250 to 300 mLs a day for each part. And yeah, that's not cheap, So it's certainly for a larger reef tank, calcium reactor makes a lot of sense. But with my tanks are in a finished basement, so in the wintertime here in Vermont, windows are closed. It is problematic. So I just did recently have an air exchange unit installed in the basement, and that's definitely helped.
So clutch.
Yeah.
How much did your pH go up when you did that?
It went from like 8.1 to like 8.3 in terms of the load of the the higher up. So like a 0.2 increase, in terms of pH.
Yeah. So one thing that people need to understand is that pH is also a logarithmic scale. So a 0.1 difference is huge,
right,
in terms of coral growth, calcifying coral growth.
Right, and I'm still kind of playing around with the air exchange unit because initially I had it running 20% of the time, and I didn't see that much of a change, maybe like a 0.1, change. But then I bumped it up to 40%, and it's got it up to like 0.2 difference. So it's certainly made an impact for me. I mean, I tried without success to run an airline, from the skimmer to a window outside. Did not really work. But I know some folks run CO2 scrubbers to try to help.
I think that's also going to be a factor of your aquarium. So I have a CO2 monitor here in the studio, and I check it twice a day. Every time I come in, I'll check it out and see what it's at. And if you have long, flat, shallow tanks like me, which have a high surface area to volume ratio, your skimmer only represents part of the gas exchange that's happening on your reef tank. If you have a tall, narrow, skinny tank with a tiny little bit of water level, your skimmer is going to represent most of the gas exchange on a tank of that size. So if your indoor air CO2 is getting up to 1 part per 1,000 ppm, and you're pulling in air from outside, you just kind of just have this dance where CO2 is coming in this way and it's going out the other way. So you might see a small difference, but it's definitely, I think in the future, it's for the home hobbyist who has a reef tank, a basic CO2 indoor monitor is going to be a big deal.
Do you think it makes a difference to have a dual chamber calcium reactor versus a single chamber calcium reactor? Any experience with that?
That's a very timely question, because my favorite calcium reactor forever, from now until forever, that I don't think will ever be topped, is the Deltec Twin Tech. Because anytime I need more calcium, I just press a button, up or down, up or down. That calcium reactor doesn't come with a secondary chamber, which is interesting because it has some of the lowest pH effluent water of any calcium reactor because it runs off a saturation state, right? On a typical calcium reactor, you're going to set it to like 6.6, 6.7, and that's what you're at. My water comes out of there at about 6.05, 6.1, so it's a lot more CO2 going into the system. So literally just last week, I forgot, it was on my list of things to do, and I just totally forgot about it. So I set up the effluent on a static second chamber. It didn't do anything. The water flowing through a static chamber of fine aragonite sand did not do jack. Because I mean, I have pH meters. I'm always like, boop, boop, boop. I mean, every day I pull out my hand, a Bluetooth pH probe, and I go around and I test everything in different places, so I'm really keeping track of stuff. So then I turned that secondary chamber into a very small makeshift calcium reactor. Basically, so I have a calcium reactor after my calcium reactor. It's just a small little recirculating jobby, and it bought me 2 points.
Oh,
But like I said earlier, pH is a logarithmic scale, so that's a lot of CO2 gone. And so then that goes down into the sump. It goes through a protein skimmer, and then it goes through my Ketomorph barrel. And yeah. So what was the original question about secondary chambers?
Yeah, do you think
I think static ones are trash. I don't know if they do anything. I really needed to actually touch base with some of my buddies who have Destaco reactors because they have secondary chambers, but those secondary chambers have more of a marble-like calcium carbonate thingy. And I would just really love to open it up and just like put it in, the first chamber and the second chamber. I don't think static second chambers are really doing anything for us. And we can test this stuff. It's really easy to test it.
Interesting. All right, so trying to keep track of the chat here. I think we've had a couple of questions popping up here that I have not asked you, Jake, and these are a couple of random questions. So I think Brock B has asked this a couple of times. We'll ask it right now. And actually, I did ask it, but then we got interrupted. I'd love to hear what the one coral I would choose and you would choose to dominate a tank. And I think we're talking SPS here. So if you had to pick one SPS coral to dominate a tank, what would that coral be?
I'm going to go with two. One or the other. I mean, it's just really, really, really hard to beat a giant scrolling cap. A giant scrolling green cap, orange cap, purple cap, like whatever it is. Like you will not be disappointed if you filled a tank with orange Capricornus, right? And in that same light, if you have a tank full of staghorn slimer, you won't be bored. It's really awesome. One or the other is just beautiful.
So I have a Cali tort that has gotten to be 24 inches across right now in the middle of my 187-gallon tank. And it looks awesome. I love that look. It looks so natural. And, it is problematic because it is shading out some other corals. And I'm going to have to get in there and do a little chopping. But
yeah, send me some. I'll trade you torts for torts.
Yeah, there you go. It's but I just love that. It is stag-like. The tort and all that sort of thing. And my I've got this what's it? The Montipora. I'm spacing on the Stellata Montipora. The tubs. That thing is
another gorgeous one.
Gigantic, and it's a problem because these things are so huge, and it's choking out circulation. There you go.
I have all the room. I have so many neat corals that I just want to share, but I don't want to sell them, but I don't want to give them away to someone who's not going to value what they are.
Yeah, so it's great to have a mature tank with big corals, and I guess the problem is when you've got other corals that have just kind of succumbed to the other corals that are just growing out of control. But listen, it's a good problem to have, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love giving away corals to tanks that are ready for them. When you put corals in the hands of someone that you know is going to be able to grow it and take care of it, that's just an awesome feeling.
Right. So here's another random question. Actually, it's a question. We were talking about this at the beginning of the show from Polyp Pal. ReefBum, can you ask Jake what his top 3 go-to books are for the hobby? Go-to books.
Well,
it's got some behind you.
Oh, this is tough because there hasn't been many great books that encapsulate. that encapsulate. You'll have to send that a copy when we trade some corals. There just hasn't been a great book. It's really hard to answer every question to the fullest. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I wouldn't think that I would say this, but Tony Vargas's book, that the Coral Reef Aquarium, it circles back to how we started this whole conversation. It shows off like 50 different tanks of varying sizes, shows what they do and how they do it. You know what I mean?
I was in that book.
Oh, really?
I think yeah. Here, hang on a second. Do you have it?
Somewhere.
Yeah, I got it somewhere. Anyway,
I think that book is awesome because it showcases examples, right? It's really hard. Like the Reef Aquarium and the modern Coral Reef Aquarium are great references for like the mid 90s. And every time I need to know something like for reals, I will pull out these books. Like I don't pull them out often, but when I do, it's because it's something I know I can really, really trust. But the modern Coral Reef Aquarium is probably one of the best because it showcases those examples. And it's two things. One, it's a roadmap for how you could do the same thing. And two, it's inspiration, right? And that inspiration is when we've been reefing and we know the ropes, the inspiration really gets your gears, jogging. It really stirs your gray matter, gets you thinking about other things.
Yeah, listen, I think books are it's kind of like a lost art form that kind of gotten away from a little bit, but great source of information. So we've got another question from Wolfgang. ReefBum, can you ask Jake, out of all the tanks that he's documented around the whole world, I had this question too, which three are your favorites and why?
The whole world? There's this guy named Wesley, and I think he's in Holland. Yeah, he's in Holland. And I visited his tank 3 years ago. And there was not one spectacular coral in the aquascape. There wasn't one showcase fish, but it was so thoughtfully put together. It was like ultra European. He's an elevator repair technician, and he's Dutch going on German. So he's got like that critical thinking applied to his reef tank. He had made his own Pax Bellum reactor. I can't remember one thing in the tank, but I remember the whole tank overall. Just like you could just sit back from across the room on the couch, have a little European cafe and some little biscuits, and just like, man, it's just beautiful, beautiful scene. And there's a video if you type in Wesley's reef tank. I did a video, and I think there's been some other features more recently. So that's one that really stood out. Faisal, I don't remember his last name. Faisal's reef tank in Abu Dhabi. Man, I remember that video. I went to Dubai and we drove in the desert. There was like rocks and camels. I'm serious. We're driving through the desert. There's a beautiful road surrounded by rock deserts and occasional camels. I'm like, where the hell are we going, y'all? And we came up to this beautiful place, and Faisal's reef tank again was really considerate. I prefer to use less equipment when appropriate, but Faisal's an engineer, and this was his first true reef tank, and he just knocked it out of the park, man. I mean, it doesn't matter that he had some steep financial resources to put this tank together. The look on his face when he saw my impression of it, that was awesome. The whole tank was awesome. The sump was cool. The lighting was cool. He did a couple little tricks that I try to showcase in the video. Faisal's reef tank was like, it stirred your gray matter and really got you thinking about what you were doing. So that was another one. And then a little bit different from that was Evan Luo's lifted aquascape, because it wasn't a peninsula tank, but it was in wall, and you could see the other side, so it's kind of peninsula. But he, you know, he was living in he lives in Australia, and he can get, you know, chunks of coral for like 30, 50, 60 bucks,
Wow.
right? But there was no rhyme or reason to his filtration. And he had a ton of lights, and on top of a ton of lights, he got even more lights, just pack it in. And he was putting corals on top of corals. And the whole bottom third, there was nothing. A little bit of rock, a little bit of sand, just flow that could just get up into the reefscape and had the longest tentacle Duncan I've ever seen. So those three are really, really nice. Those are the ones that kind of stick in mind. And there's others that were also super cool, but I don't know. Those are the first three that came to mind.
All right, we got a few other questions, and then maybe we should wrap it up. But I still got a ton of questions for you. You're gonna just have to come back, Jake, for another show here. We'll have to pick up where we left off. But here's one. I don't know if you know Reefer Reeves, but he's teeing up a question for you here that I'm sure you're gonna have an interesting answer for. Tell me your opinion on your thoughts on why or why not to use a controller.
Oh, I knew this question was going to come out somewhere. So this segues back into the previous question that you asked. Is I have arguably seen more reef tanks than anyone alive currently. You know, another 5-10 years, and maybe somebody else will be a traveling reefer. And Wesley's reef tank was the only one you're running a controller.
Wow.
There is no correlation. Actually, there's almost an inverse correlation between the quality of the tank and whether or not it's running a controller. I am the controller, you know, and I had one of the first Apexes ever given to me personally by, Kurt at the IMAC West 2009 on the Queen Mary, you know. And I started plugging stuff up. But you know what happened is then things became smarter. Your lights came with their own programming. The pumps came with their own programming. The controllable DC pumps started working. And there's very few use cases for which a controller is really necessary and actually benefits the tank. Right? Like a more smart, you know, controllable Bluetooth dosing pump is $60.
Wow.
You want the Wi-Fi version? It's $80.
Wow.
You know what I mean? It's like, and that's a company that manufactures their own dosing pumps, and they make their own pumps, and they make their own pumps, and they make their own pumps. That's important to repeat because they're not buying something from somebody else and tweaking it a little bit. That is a dosing pump company. You know, what light are you going to buy today that doesn't have built-in programming? You know, unless it's like a strip light or something. Right? Radion, Kessel, AI. You know, they all have that built up. I guess the Kessel you have to kind of add it on, but they do it in a smart way. So if you know, like how often, I mean, just last week, man, I heard about a major system malfunction at a major coral dealer, and Apex is on every system. They didn't get the notice.
Wow.
You know, the Apex system and other controllers, one of two things happens, right? Everybody says in case stuff, in case of this and that. But I've had wipeouts a long time ago, and so when I'm building a reef tank, I am thinking critically about how everything can go wrong. Every little thing. I'm always thinking, this can go wrong, this can go wrong, I have to watch that. And two things happens when you have a controller. Either it sends you too many alerts and you turn them off because it's annoying, or it doesn't send you the random alert for the thing you needed to know. You know what happened at this one major dealer that everyone of you knows, but I'm not going to call them out because they don't know that I know. Somebody flipped a switch and all the water backflowed, you know, into the sump. So all the probes were still in the sump, and so as far as the Apex was concerned, everything was hunky dory. There wasn't. I guess if they had a leak detector, that would have sent somebody an alert. But so again, it's one of those cases. If it's sending you alerts for a bunch of stuff, you probably will turn those off. And there's so many of the aquarium authorities that, you know, that they got their gear for free, and so they don't want to say, hey, I had this problem. Like, you know, people, you know, have had multiple tank meltdowns where if the apex was functioning or other controller was working, it's not that it wasn't working, it's just it's combination of the product and the user error, right? So I mean, we could talk about controllers for a while.
Yeah.
One, there's a little bit of user error, but if you set up your reef tanks to fail fail without issue, right? Every time you set up a reef tank, you should go ahead and pull that plug and just watch everything, and plug it back in and see what it does. Your Apex can't do that for you.
Right.
Your Profilux can't do that for you. You know, and people spend so much of their energy learning how to use the controller. They get all these if, this, then that, and they're so proud of it. And at the end of the day, it does not result in a better reef tank. Because, you know, if we were having this live stream 10 years ago, I think I would have a very different perspective on it, because back then all our pumps were dumb, all our lights were dumb. But now I use $5. I use $5 Wi-Fi outlets for so many things, and I can hold my breath in the time it takes me to set each one of those up. I don't have to ever log in. I don't ever have to connect directly Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. Pull up the app, it's so fast. And here's my thing about aquarium controllers also. Like, I am a techie. Most of my reef aquarium blogging comes from a near lifetime of reading tech aquarium blogs. If controller manufacturers were really invested in turning their devices into aquarium computers, they would have an updated model that reflected consumer electronics every 2 years. You know, how is an EB8 gonna, I don't know, what does it cost, $100, $150? Is that how much an EB8 is?
Something like that.
Yeah. Do you know how much a Wi-Fi controllable power strip is?
A lot cheaper.
It's 25. It's 25, and it works like that. Sure, it's not connected to other things, but like the eCoral Lite, it's a tiny little box. It's a Raspberry Pi inside. It basically just has a couple things you can plug in, and it's got a separate Wi-Fi outlet that works in tandem with it. If the aquarium controller manufacturers, and I'm not talking about the tricky stuff that they're doing, like the Trident, like the KH Director, like the Alcatronic, that's breaking new ground, right? But if they were really tracking consumer electronics, you would never buy an EB8. You would just be able to incorporate, you know, any one of a number of these Wi-Fi controllable power strips to your setup for like $20. But they have to make money, and they have to make the case for it. But, you know, at the end of the day, it infuriates me to see people spending literally thousands of dollars on, they will get their tank and stand, maybe they'll get their sump and their skimmer, and then they will throw thousands of dollars at a controller before the tank has water in it. So personally, emotionally, I rail against controllers because it's a different hobby, right? I feel like Macna/Mazna has been way too focused on fish breeding. You cannot win the Aquarius of the Year award unless you bred a fish. You know, and those are great, but that's a different hobby in a sense. 99% of the revenue and action and discussion about the reef aquarium hobby is corals, is growing corals, is making reef tanks. It's not about breeding fish. That's a different hobby. It's as if we, you know, kept recognizing the seahorse people, which that used to happen. Seahorse people used to have an outsized presence in the reef aquarium hobby. I'm like, that's not reef aquariums. That's seahorse tanks. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so like with the controllers, it's interesting. There's a guy around the corner from me. His name is Jacob. He's got a crazy like nuclear submarine back room to control his 200-gallon tank. You know, the tank is fine. The tank is totally fine. But in the back room, there's just connections to everything. And he doesn't even just have like float switches to tell him his reservoirs are full. He's got like that pressure sensitive safe tape to tell him what level his fresh and saltwater reservoirs are at. You know what I mean? And so it's like, that guy, he knows what he wants. He knows what he likes. He's into the control and the mission control room aspects. When you see his tank and you see the back room, like, all right, that back room is substantially more full fleshed out than the tank itself. And that's fine because he actually owns it up front. He's like, I'm into the controllability. So I just don't want anybody to think, you know, there's all these messages coming from every different direction. The hobby's bigger than it's ever been, but there's these messages like, oh, you have to have a controller. I watch live streams I try to watch live streams all the time. And there's guys that will spend an hour talking about control this, control this, control this, control this. And for an hour, they don't mention one fish. They don't mention one coral.
Yeah.
They don't talk about the livestock, you know? So it's fine if you own up to that being your hobby, but I like being in control. That's why I don't have controllers.
That's why. Yeah. No, I think
I am the controller.
I agree. You know, I think you can really go down a bad rabbit hole if you have too many variables in play tied into a controller. I mean, you know, the way I use a controller is it's more of a monitor for me. I don't do a lot of controlling with it. You know, there's some, but you know, for instance, with the KH Director, what do we got there? Yeah, right. With the KH Director, you know, you could do the you know, adaptive control in terms of controlling your dosing for 2-part or controlling the calcium reactor. And I've gone back and forth with that, and it's certainly very practical in terms of being able to do that. And it can lock in your DKH by doing that, by using that kind of feature. But the reason why I wouldn't want to use that feature sometimes is because I like to kind of see what my tank is doing in terms of consuming. Is it consuming, you know, calcium and alkalinity like it should be? Is that alkalinity dropping, you know, gradually over time? Then I know the tank is healthy. If I'm doing the adaptive control, you know, I got to log in and I got to look at the data and stuff like that. And so I'm a bit lazy on that end. So, but that's just me.
Yeah, so I'm just like flipping through these pages because, you know, before the Apex, there was the Aqua Controller Junior from Neptune Systems. But before that, it was all about the Octopus Aquadyne. I swear to God, there's an ad in here from the 1990s. Octopus Aquadyne does every single thing the Apex does today for about $400, and it will even send you a message on your pager. You know, there's
Who has a pager these days?
It's the same idea, right? Same freaking principle. It will alert you to problems, and it's just like, this is not. There's been no progress. If you look at consumer electronics, and then you look at what's being charged for the controller stuff, it doesn't make any sense. Consumer electronics have gotten faster, better, smaller, and cheaper. Meanwhile, in the aquarium hobby, it's like more expensive, harder to use, and more expensive and more expansive. And it's really frustrating because there isn't a middle ground right now, because I've really been looking into this. There isn't I love monitors, I love the data, but there isn't a middle ground between a $20 pH probe, pH pen, and a $400 to $800 a full-blown aquarium controller. You want those. There's a lot of monitors that will just, you know, show a display, but if you want logging and Wi-Fi, any kind of smarts, that kind of goes hand in hand, right? And so it's ridiculous that there isn't a $100 wireless pH, ORP, temperature, Wi-Fi logger, right? If you look at everything that our freaking cell phones can do, there is enough off-the-shelf components to build something like a Raspberry Pi that will measure all that stuff reliably, web connected, log all that stuff for like $100 with room, you know, to put some meat on the bones for the person who makes it to make some money, right? And it's just that's a disappointment part, right? All about monitoring, but I wish there were some companies who went all in on the monitoring side and didn't try to, make you buy into the whole ecosystem.
Right, I got you. All right, Jake, I got one last question. I think it's going to be a short question for you. It's popped up a few times, so I think we got to run it up the flagpole there. Ugly Man's Reefing. Please ask Jake how his Australian Dallas Acro is going.
Oh, man. That is one that I don't have anymore.
Ah, bummer.
Just, growing pains, starting out the studio, this and that. And the reason I haven't set up the 400 is because it took me a while to get the 3 coral flats going. And then it took me a certain amount of bandwidth to get some of the other displays going. And I want to make sure everything is rocking and rolling before I set up the 400. But, there were some growing pains. And, first year, I'm just acquiring. I did share it with some people, but I wasn't achieving the level of growth that I had hoped for because I don't use a reverse osmosis unit. And, of course, I set my water off to be tested with ICP analysis and came up 0. And little did I know that I get pulses of copper coming through my water. And for a while there, I thought I was just good at growing acros and nothing else. And then I just started getting a little bit more critical with it. And then I found out that pulses of copper were kind of coming through my water. And so now I still don't have an RO. I address the one issue. So I have 4 very high capacity carbon blocks, each rated for 5,000 gallons per hour. So 20,000 gallons per hour, 5,000 gallons total. 20,000 gallons for all 4 blocks. And then I have a flow meter that measures exactly how much water is coming out of there. When it hits 5,000 gallons, which is a quarter of what those 4 blocks are capable of, I switch it up. Now I have 0 copper issues and no more coral problems. But yeah, the Dallas Acro is right up there with, it's a piece of culture, like aquarium culture. Like I don't care what it costs, but it's different from the Slimer. It's really cool though that it's a green staghorn style acro that has that same legacy as the Stuber Acropora in Europe and the Slimer in the United States. So I don't have any Slimer right now. I actually have one piece of acro that's a bunch of encrusted pieces that could be the Slimer. I'm sorry, the Dallas, but I've lost track of what it actually is. So I have to let all the little chunks grow back in and let it grow out. But I will definitely get some again.
Cool.
Because I shared it.
Nice. All right, dude. Well, listen, this has been a blast, and I really hope you come back on because we got I think we got a lot of things to talk about some more, and I'm sure the folks would appreciate it. But thanks, Jake.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm done though.
You're not done?
Unless no, I need to ask you. Some
you're gonna ask me some questions?
Tell us about your tank. Yeah, so where are you at in the cycling of your reef tank?
It's
or the maturation of your reef tank.
The maturation. So it's I think it's about 3.5 months in, and it cycled in about a week. So it was, and I added fish about a week after that. So I added some 4 green chromas to the tank. And then a week after that, I actually added 4 tangs that I had in my frag tank that was leaking. So I had to do something. So I put more fish in there. And I've got about 20 fish in there right now. And
how many corals you got in there?
0.
Why?
I know. I'm getting ready. I'm just taking it slow. Nothing good happens when you go quickly in a reef.
I know, but I add corals to my tanks like 2 days in.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there is no cycling that the corals need. That's just not a thing.
Yeah.
Like you can't to me otherwise. I've literally been researching the topic for a while. There's no mechanism by which corals can be harmed by ammonia. Like it's just not, it doesn't happen. And I feel like I had this conversation with Ryan Batchelor at Bulk Reef Supply of, people who are adding more corals early on are actually having more success because the corals bring in the kind of biology that you need. And then you add the fish later. That's another thing that's infuriating right alongside the controllers. The same people cycle their reef tanks with fish for 6, 9, 12 months and there's no corals in there. Like, dude, just throw the corals in, man.
Yeah.
The only thing you want to consider is like careful placement,
right? Careful
grow out,
right?
But man, you should.
Yeah, it's gonna be happening very, very soon. It's been kind of tough to kind of look at that blank slate, but I've got a plan believe you me, that the good thing is that I've got other corals that I've been growing out, so I can kind of do some tester frags, which is great, right? I don't have to like risk buying new stuff and putting in that tank. I just want to make sure.
There is no risk.
Yeah.
I am telling you right now, I've done this dozens of times. The only problem you have down the road is introducing pests, right? So if you start with frags and you clean them up or you fresh cut them so that's just tissue, there is no risk. You know what you're doing.
Well,
right?
here's the one.
Got water flow. You've got mineral management. What's the risk?
Here's the one chink in the armor for me. I've never used LEDs before, so this is my first tank with LEDs. I've always used halides and T5s, so it's a learning process for me. I have 6 GHL Mitras over this tank.
That's a very underrated light, I think. I don't know if it's due to marketing or just, GHL not being plugged into the American scene, but I have the original Mitras, and I know it's gotten way better over time. That's an underrated light. I think you'll do very, very well with it. And do you have, your tank is kind of wide, right?
It's 36 inches wide.
So you have 2 rows of them?
I've got 2 rows of 3 Mitras each row. Yeah.
So that's really clutch, right? So one thing I'm seeing, so my tanks is they're 8 feet long. I have 4 radions, and the light's bright enough for the acros right underneath. But then I have another tank where I have 6, so I have 3 on each side. So you have that overlapping light that you're used to having from banks of T5s or huge metal halide reflectors. So when you have that overlapping light, that's where it's at. I'm surprised you went with, if you've never used LEDs before. What's on your frag tank?
I have halides on the frag tank, but I have a new frag tank that's going to be plumbed into the new tank. So I've got 2 separate systems now. So I'm going to have I've got the new tank, which will be a separate system with the frag tank plumbed in, and then on my 187 gallon tank, I've got 2 frag tanks plumbed into that thing, and that's all halides.
So one tip about the LEDs. Turn off the reds, turn off the greens, just to start. Like red is so potent, and even those cool whites, so potent, they can bleach some corals out. Yeah. I think it's just too much power matching up with that chlorophyll absorption spectrum. So, I mean, you could put it on later on, but you're probably like me. You probably like a more daylight spectrum, but start it out bluer, go a little easier on the cool white, and just don't touch the reds, don't touch the green. The red is there to drive photosynthesis and bring out, it probably has hyper reds, which is really great for fish colors. The green is there mostly to balance out the red, because if you only have red, it looks funky. So yeah, just definitely turn those off or turn those down. Like on any of my tanks, man, I never run the reds more than peaking at like 30%. I mean, manufacturers now, they know each cluster is going to have one LED because it's so effective. But yeah, man, if I was at your house and we were having some beers, I'd be like, let's load
get this party started.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, are you gonna do like one bombie at a time? Because that would be kind of cool. Do you have bombies?
What's a bombie?
Just like a cluster.
Oh, clusters. I've got 2 islands. So okay. And that also have some like lagoons going off the islands, if you can kind of imagine that. So yeah, it's minimalistic, but what I had. A buddy of mine actually telegram on YouTube and Instagram. Great guy, Jim, did me solid. He essentially put together this spectrum for the Mitras that mimic the AB plus spectrum for the Ecotex, and also mimics the spectrum very closely for 250 watt radium bulbs, as well as 400 watt Hamilton bulbs. So it's very close to the spectrum for those halide bulbs, and because that's what I know. That's what I've been using in terms of the halide. So I kind of wanted to bring a little old school into the new school in terms of the LEDs and have that spectrum that I'm used to seeing. And yeah, I do like a whiter versus bluer look. It's been strange because it is a bluer spectrum than what I'm running right now in my other tank. So when I look at that new tank and I see the blueness, and I look over to the 187 gallon tank, which is being lit by 400 watt 20K radiums, I'm like, wow, that's a big difference. And that's something that for me to have to get used to. But And listen, it's nice to have a little variety too.
Yeah, but you have your salinities locked in.
Everything is locked in, you know.
Your temperature's locked in. You already have the calcium reactor set up because I saw the
Yeah.
video. I would be more comfortable about adding acros to your tank than I would be if you're going to do any LPS. Are you going to do SPS totally
It's going to be
dominant?
dominant SPS. I'm going to have a couple of LPS. I'm going to put a big hammer coral that I have in my 187 gallon tank in that tank. I'm going to put I've got some nice alveopora that I'm going to put in a low flow section in between the islands, probably in the new tank. So there's gonna, you know, because I want to put some clownfish in there. So I want to try to like get some things into the new tank that clownfish can host, and but it will be SPS dominant. So the only thing that I got to work on right now is my nutrients are a little high. My nitrates are 25 part per million in the new tank, and the phosphates are 0.1. It's not bad, And I got a Pax Bellum ARID algae reactor that I got to fire up, so I could bring it down a little bit. But for the most part, things are pretty stable.
The only thing that slows me down from packing a tank full of corals is the consideration that I give to where I'm going to put each coral and how it's going to interact with its neighbor. Has nothing to do with nutrients or time. As soon as your temperature's stable, salinity stable, and you have some, I will put corals in a tank before I have the doser set up, before the calcium reactor's going, because there's a big enough volume there, a big enough a resource for then you can add that stuff later. But man, if we were at your house, we'd be having an aquascaping party. I would be more gun shy about putting in the hammer and any kind of trackies and chalices than acros or apostolopores. Just go to town, man. Or at the very least, like always put in a small indicator coral on day 2.
Yeah.
Just you watch the polyps expand and it's going to relate almost as much information as like reading all the levels. But yeah, man, you should definitely and if you have frag tanks like me, you have the same kind of thing going on. I have 3 4x8 flats, and I go over there, and that's my paints that I use on my aquarium canvases. And the only thing that slows me down from putting corals everywhere is where are they going to go?
Yeah, Greg Carroll is asking me if I'm going to go AB plus, why not go with the original? I just want a little old school in there. That's all, Greg. I just want that little old school halides hybrid spectrum in there. So that's I don't know. You're probably right. It's probably not going to make a hell of a difference.
Greg is right in that AB plus almost doesn't mean anything to me. Like you're always going to tweak your spectrum. No one's going to, unless you're totally hands-off hobbyist, you're not going to just set that spectrum and leave it. But you get so used to whatever light you have, whatever color you have, and intensity is a little bit different game, and the spread is important for coral capture. But you get so used to that color. I'm actually really curious to see how you come out with the Mitras, because every manufacturer has. All right, so say Ecotech Marine has royal blues and Mitras has royal blues. They're not the exact same royal blues. Even if they're Cree, there's 5 different bins for every single wavelength emission peaks. You know what I'm saying? And so it's going to be really different. So if you start out with AB+, I still encourage you to just tweak it, just eyeball it, with your eyes. That's the real old school. Not taking spectrographs. I've seen, who was it? Build My LED. God, I miss those guys, man. They made some great freaking strip lights. You can make everything you want. They had a radium spectrum one that looked nothing like a radium. I absolutely believe that the spectrograph that it put out, that it created, matched what a radium did. But to your eyes, it did not look like a radium. They had greens and different shades of reds and all kinds of purples in there. I'm like that.
You could tell distinctly what a radium lit tank looks like, for sure. Yeah. ACI Chris from ACI Agriculture. When are you taking calls from the audience?
That's the thing we're kind of missing at the Reef Aquarium shows, and I think it'll come back in force, when we have real reef shows, real regional and national and international reef shows, just talking reef, just really comparing notes. So yeah, I know Chris is great because him and I, we just bounce ideas off of each other, and that's so much better for hashing out what you think And so he's doing certain things and I'm doing certain things to kind of get to the same place, and we're finding what works for us. And definitely with your Mitras LEDs, like the light that they put off is no different from a metal halide or a T5, but the spread that they produce is very different. But I am so glad that you have 2 rows, because you're going to have almost like a hybrid system between having 3 metal halide pendants versus a bank of T5s. Your tank is going to rock.
Yeah, I think so. I think I was considering doing some T5 supplements, but I was like, I didn't want to get too crazy, and I wanted that clean look. So I just I thought that the 2 rows of the 3 would work. And I did some par readings on the lights, and I got some sick par readings on those things, like 400 to 500 par readings in the upper part of the on the tank, in between the island, in between the fixtures. So I was real happy with that. And I've never taken par readings of any of my tanks, and so they're higher than what I'm getting out of my halides right now over my my other tanks.
I only take par measurements when I know that I'm at opposite extremes of light intensity. Personally from experience that a certain acro can do so much better at 250 micromoles with T5s coming from every direction and saturating every single branch versus 500 micromoles coming straight down from metal halide, or a really directional LED light. So that's another one. I'm just like, people ask me par values all the time. Like, this is not informative to you. I could tell you numbers, but for example, you have Apogee makes 5 different meters, and they have one that's specially tuned for aquarium use, and then they have a correct immersion coefficient, and most people are just sticking it in the water and they forget about the immersion coefficient. And then I have a light core par meter that is a spherical sensor that measures light coming from every single direction. That is, you can do science with that. You can't do science with the Apogee one. You know what I mean? Like, the Apogee is a prosumer at best. Right. But I'm still just like, I'm glad you have 2 banks of LEDs, because you're going to get that overlap that your Estonies are going to totally freaking love. Do you have them turned in just a little bit?
I do not. I mean, I probably could do that if I wanted to, but the coverage on the lights is awesome. I mean, I don't have any shading whatsoever. So it's.
I just like to turn them in. I want to leave no photons behind. I don't want it to spill out of the tank, but also just get a little less light falling on your glass, so you don't have to scrub it as often.
Yeah. Sounds like a smart idea. Yeah. So I'm psyched. I'm psyched. You're right. It's time.
So I know you're trying to get off, but I still want to talk about the coral prices.
All right.
So right now, everybody knows people aren't flying around, right? So the price of freight has gone through the roof.
Yes.
So 2 things. 1, the price of freight is very expensive, but 2, because there's fewer flights, a lot of shipments have to take circuitous paths. They can't necessarily go boom, boom. They have to go boom, 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 and then it just adds to the overall freight cost of the corals. And so if you're a coral importer, you don't want to stack $20 worth of freight fees on top of a bubble coral that lands for $10, right? So what do? You buy only the super fancy choice stuff. So I've been window shopping like crazy for like 2 weeks, and unless it's just super basic common stuff that's locally grown, the wholesale prices are reaching retail levels. And so that's one of those things that is not forever. The collectors and importers are focusing on the ultra. I mean, if you go to some of these coral vendors' pages, you will see hyper ultra or mega ultra rare, and you're just like, how can you put rare on every coral, or how can you put ultra rare on 12 Cinerinas that you have in stock? Like, you have 12 Cinerinas in stock. They're not ultra rare if you have ultra rare on all of them, right? So you definitely have this situation right now where it makes a lot more economic sense for the importers to only bring in the super crazy stuff. But if corals are very expensive, you can call up any of these companies or any stores and say, hey, what's not selling right now? Unless it's paramount to you to be in the club because you bought the crazy Fraggle tenuous for $500 and you want great looking frags that grow out to be muddy colonies. Call people up, man. If you're a store, call up wholesalers. Like, what's not selling?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
give me some of that, because every average coral in the peak of health is going to look just as good across the room as, you know, say a rainbow tenuous or a hypercolored millie. So this is a temporary situation, and it's definitely going to be up to all of us to push back on some of those crazy coral prices. Be like, no. Turbinaria, a cup coral, small colony, I don't care where it's from, should be about $60. You know, maybe $80 if it's really great looking. Don't just offer me yellow scroll corals for $150. The hobby was not built on that. And it's going to be, I think, really important to all of us to give a little bit of pushback on all this hyper coral trend. But like, yo, I want some supporting actors, right? I have some sick, crazy looking scalemias in my scalemia party aquarium.
That's an awesome tank.
But dude, I wish you could see it in real life, because like as soon as I'm done filming, I'm like, what the hell? You know, how many tanks I have here, and how many times that tank stops me in my tracks when I walk by. But now, I don't want master scolies. I don't want crazy stuff. I need a couple basic UFOs. I need a couple button scolies. I need a couple Micromusa Pacificas to make it a balanced thing. If the entire wall is all crazy ultra corals, none of them will stand out. And I feel that's the same thing in the aquarium hobby. You know, prices, first of all, not all coral prices are through the roof. Only through the roof coral prices make the headlines, right?
Yeah.
No one is promoting their Galaxia frags for $20 because they're not going to get any attention for their $20 Galaxia frags. You know what I'm saying? Right? There is a ton there, but we just see the veneer of supporting actor. Like, it's like apparel. No one is excited about socks, right? They just want to show off their blazer, or their hat, or their fly kicks. But the socks get no mention. You know, socks are never going to cost more than $10, $20 if they're really, really fancy. And I feel that's the same way with corals. And, you know, for those of people who want some more affordable corals, go to your mom and pop shops. Go to the non-reef shops that just happen to have a saltwater tank, because, man, one of the best freshwater aquarium stores in town, they have a couple frag tanks with like 8-foot VHOs. I have no idea where they got those. And they buy random frags from the wholesalers that are made in like factory line. No one has the time or the attention to really examine the detail of all these corals. But once they've been sitting at that freshwater fish store for 1 to 3 months, you really know what you're getting. And you know what? They're 3 frags for $45. When I want some cheap frags, I go to the freshwater fish store.
And they're diamonds in the rough, you know, sometimes.
They're diamonds in the rough, yeah, for sure. And there's just, the lords have been sitting there in high nutrients because they have a you know, janky protein skimmer. They also have lower light, so the corals are mega puffy. So yeah, you want some cheap corals? Like, go to your mom and pop shop that you would never think to go to, right? The reef stores, they know how much they can charge for this and that. But I find so many great, what I call used fish and used corals that have been traded in and got too big. Man, sometimes I'll get a big old chunk of coral for like $50 because the store, they don't know it. And sometimes I will offer them more than they're asking. You know, so that's one way to do it. And I know it's getting a little late on your end, but definitely going to be hounding you a little bit to get some corals.
Yeah. No, I need it, and I appreciate it. Hey, Remarkable Reefs, many thanks for the contribution. Really, really appreciate that. Your buddy Chris from ACI is saying good advice there, Jake. But then he said, what was the other comment? Just tell him to stop talking, sounding like me.
Well, you know, it's all pent up because I haven't been able to go to reef shows and like talk to folks, and you get a platform. Like, I don't want to have my own live streams, man. That's boring. Well, I feel like I just talk to the ether.
You're welcome anytime on this show here, Jake. Let me say that. So, listen, dude, thank you so much for being a part of this. Really appreciate it. And you know, anybody just any more questions, drop some comments in the chat, and we'll try to get it to Jake if he doesn't see it himself. But listen, thanks, man. Really appreciate it. Next week, I got another great guest. Next Thursday, February 11th at 7 p.m. I got Julian Sprung coming on. So,
Oh boy,
yeah, so that's...
I'm gonna be hassling you with like super chats, and you guys, you know, we work so hard to create content. Everybody who's watching this, you know, throw us a few bucks to buy a beer. Like, you know, it's reward enough to sit here and talk reef. I'll do this all day long for a roof over my head, but like just throw out a few bucks. It's not about the money. It's just about, you know, showing someone that you value what's going down. So I'm going to be annoying the crap out of you with super chats and Julian's next week. I got to come up with one really good question for Julian. It's going to make
Yeah.
So, but you know, shout out to everybody who participated in the chat, who threw out the super chat. I want to say hi to my buddy Greg Carroll and Chris Meckley. Chris will be a great guy to have on the stream.
He's coming on.
Keep him focused on one topic because him and I, I think we hesitate to pick up the phone from each other because we know it's a half hour to an hour ordeal. Try to pick on one thing specifically for Chris, especially probably like the culturing of corals, because he's really like laser focused in on that lately. And look at that, you just got a $10 super chat from John Reefer Vermont.
Oh, I didn't even see that. Thank you so much. Oh, there we go. Oh yeah, and Reefing with O. Thanks. Awesome.
Oh, I think we need to keep.
Yeah, you're saying all the right things, Drake. Well, listen, dude, I'll let you go, and I appreciate it again. And until next week, everybody, be well, be safe, and we'll see you next time.
Make sure to tune in next week for Julian Sprung, because I'll definitely be in the chat and I'll be answering questions and pestering the audience then. Awesome. So thanks for having me, Keith, and we'll catch you on the flip.
All right, man. Thanks, Drake. Later.
All right, later.